Ya hey ya ya hey oy ya hey ya ya hey oy ya hey ya ya hey ya ya hey ya ya hey oy
And we bring
ya
to you
hey.
today Dr. Tane Ward. We're talking about some very deep, um, heavy-hitting kind of stuff having to do with the border and the issues and the things that are going on there. Just to give you a little bit of information about Dr. Tane Ward. How do you say your first name? It's Ricardo Tane Ward Ramirez. You're a scholar, a writer, and organizer based out of Austin, Texas. You have 15 years experiences working with indigenous communities to protect their lands and preserve their sovereignty. You've led many campaigns against logging, mining, dams, port and oil, gas infrastructure, and you've been an advisor, an organizer, manager, director, working with sovereign nations, Pueblo people, native nations, small, large, grassroots communities. You do a lot of poetry, nonfiction, as well as fiction based on your experiences working with indigenous communities throughout North and South America here in Turtle Island. And predominantly you've done a lot of work in North Colombia, and that your descent is, how do you say that?
Tlaxcala.
Say that again?
Tlaxcala.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And you earned your PhD in anthropology that focuses on Native American and Indigenous Studies in 2014 from the University of Texas. Thank you so much for coming on Native Wavelength. I really, really appreciate, and I know I've worked alongside of you with a lot of the different things that you've done. I think the first time I met you was when we were, you had helped organize the march for the coal mine in Eagle Pass. You know, I think that was the first time I met you, or at least I might have met you in passing other places, but that's really where I got to see some of who you are and what you're about. And so I think that you have a lot of pretty good ideas in terms of what is the political gains or what's really going on the border, because I think there's a lot of misinterpretation, and it's purposely done in the media in terms of the crisis or the thing that's going on at the border.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's an honor to be here, and thanks for addressing this issue. As you were mentioning, I have had a lot of experience working against this mega project developments, like oil pipelines, and maybe we'll talk about that in one of these coming weeks. And recently, I have to add to my resume fighting against the border itself, not only because there's a construction of a border wall, which is this colonial idea, which is very racist. There's also this detention of these migrant children, many of whom are indigenous. But I think that one of the questions that you're interested in right now, and one of the things that's so important about focusing on Texas, is the border region as this colonial construct in the first place. Why and how these nationalist borders have always been projects which hurt indigenous peoples. Why the carving up of land by foreign powers in other places is always going to hurt local peoples, and how that's really just a small part of how colonialism really works to disempower people, the relationships with each other, the relationship with the land, and all sorts of stuff like that. And I think that I'm happy to at least have this discussion with you, and hopefully more people can start having the discussion about why colonialism is such an important part of this crisis at the border.
Absolutely. I know, when I talk to some of my native elders, my Apache elders, we refer to it as a frontera,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
And I don't know what your knowledge is, but I'm curious to ask you is what is the history of the border in respect to indigenous First Nation people?
Yeah, well, it's amazing how this works. Oftentimes, these border regions, we think of them as just being part of this line that was in there, that has always been there, and it really hasn't been, right? This is a ridiculous thing. If you go to people and they live in this borderland and they're used to it there, and you say, hey, let's get rid of this border. It's not doing anyone any good. It's dividing people. It makes it harder for an economic reality for people to survive and do well in these places. Some of the poorest counties in the United States are along the border region. A lot. Not only poverty, but crime rates are always bad in these places. Why and how do these slums get created around these border regions? They're often heavily militarized. There's all these problems that arise. why is that? And is one question we to ask ourselves. And then what can we do about it to get rid of these borders? And what's so fascinating is that even if you take a timeline, let's take 100 years. If we started working now to get rid of this border for 100 years, would we be able to do it? And people's immediate response is, well, 100 years we'll all be dead from global warming or something. They can imagine the end of the world before they can imagine that there's no line between the United States and Mexico. They think of it as this normal thing. And as you're saying, you're on both sides of the border. Your people have crossed these lands and well beyond for generations, for centuries, for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
And that's absolutely the case here. It's interesting that before the colonial period, Anahuac, which is this Mesoamerican region, extended up until a kind of an approximate area of where there's this borderland, where there's these large deserts which are hard to cross. But what you'll find is that indigenous peoples, you were asking me before, like, where are your people from? My people are from Tlaxcala, which is a multi-ethnic indigenous nation that existed well before the colonial period, Otomi and Nahuatl-speaking peoples. This is a place that, an Inde person who was living in Texas 600 years ago, they may have gone to university in a place like Tlaxcala. We have to think of this international world that existed once a long time ago. And that oftentimes when people think about the Americas or Turtle Island, they don't really think of it as this diverse, multi-ethnic place like you would when you think about the old world.
Right.
China and Persia and all of these great ancient kingdoms, Greece and Rome and Egypt. We think of this long history of these interesting places that existed for thousands of years and have different cultures. And
we don't say that about our own people,
We don't.
our own continent.
And we actually have that here. We have ancient culture and history that existed a long time, and these trade routes and these ways you'll find that historically speaking, there's evidence for migration always having happened across these continents. Settlement patterns which go from north to south, south to north, different languages mixing. People have always migrated. People have always moved, and our connection with each other is based on being able to move and cross lands freely and in communication with the people who are already there,
and
having respect for them, having respect for the land, and it's a really beautiful idea. And what you see with colonialism is you see this imposition of it's not allowed. Somebody else is going to control that place, who gets to come and go, and what gets to come and go across that border. And nationalist projects are always defined by their borders. So we have a border here, and Texas and Mexico have this long, one of the longest militarized borders in the world.
Wow.
And increasingly more and more militarized. Why and how that border was put right there, who put it there and why, is a pretty complex history, but we have to think of it as that was the line that benefited white supremacy the most. To go too far down, you maybe can't control the land, not far enough, you don't have as much. And then the formation of Texas and the United States, this border region was placed where it was in order to really get more power in the hands of wealthy landowners who have kept it ever since.
I think 97% of the land in Texas is owned privately.
It is, and this is even for the United States, so that's a lot. And so we've seen this has always been an issue historically, and one of the things that happens is it cuts all these indigenous communities in half. So one of the amazing things about it is who decides that the border goes there. Now, geographically speaking, the best natural place for a border is the ridge on a mountain, the highest place that you can find. And in the valleys, you're likely to find cultures that live in valleys around drainage systems that are connected to each other. So a river is technically speaking the worst place you could put a border. And nobody from that region would ever put a border there, because it doesn't make any sense.
Right, the animals go there, the people go there.
Exactly.
Water is life, they go around, yes.
So the people who made that border actually being negotiated in places like Mexico City or Washington, D.C. or even Austin don't actually know why or how that border was put there. It just looked good on a map. right? So this is this foreign imposition, and then you see that there's all these communities that actually come from the border, of course, because the Rio Grande is such an important geographical site of water and culture. So all of these indigenous people, you mentioned your own community, the Nde, of course here in Texas, Carrizo and Coahuitecan and other indigenous groups throughout the border regions are all located along the Rio Grande, and you see that they have been negatively impacted as well. Toto'onan peoples, Yaqui peoples, throughout across the borderlands, you'll see that there has been a problem historically with the border region happening, and then now you have this immediate crisis which is happening with the wall and detention and the ways in which that's affecting indigenous peoples today. That's a whole other story.
Yeah, absolutely. And my next question would be do you think there's a humanitarian crisis on the border?
Well, I mean, absolutely. If you think about what we think about when we see humanitarian crisis, there is 184 detention facilities in Texas, for example, that are housing migrants right now. That's presumably a problem for people who think that keeping people incarcerated is a problem, and enforcing the sort of criminal penalties for crossing a border is a problem. I'd say that I think that it is, and that's certainly a problem. Now, when you talk about a crisis, you have to think about there's been 24 people who have died in immigration custody in the last year or so. This starts to look a lot worse. And I think that one of the things that we have to notice is that right now there's a lot of media attention around these things because of the way in which the Trump administration is overtly racist when they're enacting their policies and the way that the president talks about these things. That was less the case under Obama, who deported more than 2.5 million immigrants. He was, which was more than any president who had ever come before him.
Wow.
They were detaining 34,000 people daily with that administration, and that number has increased. However, this was not covered in the same way. And then, of course, the criminalization of immigration happened under Bill Clinton's presidency as well. So this is not a new. It's not a new idea. And of course, we could trace that legacy all the way back to this history we were just talking about, the creation of the border and deciding who gets to come across and who doesn't.
I guess the thing that I'm most concerned about too, and it's because I'm a mom.
Right.
I'm a mother, and are there the hygiene? Are these children being sexually abused? Is there why what kind of psychological trauma is inflicted on that? To me, that's the crises.
Right.
And I think that and I'm always skeptical, and I always want to have an open mind. But are we taking care of these children? Mm-hmm. Are they reaching their parents?
Right. Well, absolutely, they're not, and that's a really big problem. There's a
no soap, no toothbrushes.
Yes.
I mean,
and one of the
diapers.
things is that these are government agencies. There's also a lot of private prisons that are running immigrant detention as well.
And that was going to be my next question. Who's profiting from this? Who's profiting from all of these lives?
Right. Well, there's a great organization called Grassroots Leadership, and they have excellent reports on exactly how the private prison industry works and detention facilities. They've been running campaigns for more than a decade out of Texas, for example, the Teton Hutto detention facility. And I remember taking my own child when they were 7, so 11 years ago or something like that, to protest against this immigrant detention, and specifically children being housed in immigrant detention, full-on orange jumpsuits and what have you, back years ago. And so this is a continuation. This is a continuation of a policy that already existed. What happens is it's worse now. So what happens is that you have a policy where immigrants are being treated as criminals. That's a problem. You start arresting them. That's a problem. You start arresting their children. That's a problem. You start taking away their basic rights. You see that we're moving towards more of a punitive element with migration, punishing people for coming across the border. And the Trump administration has been very forthright in this idea that they're trying to deter people from coming across. But I think that it's also important to notice that really what these borders are about is not keeping people out, but controlling who comes across, when, and why. because there's a lot of people who benefit from migration and from keeping a very low wage worker here in the United States, especially doing agrarian labor, doing domestic work, doing construction work, where people are getting paid below the minimum wage, and these big agribusinesses are making a lot of money, and they're not paying people fair wages for their work. Oftentimes there's lots of workers' rights abuses as well, and when they need to blow the whistle and have a bunch of people deported so they don't have to pay these wages, they can rely on the state to do that work for them. The state is also managing who then is able to come across and keeping those that they don't want by this increase in militarization. So there's this whole apparatus which is, building walls and drones and soldiers, technology, weapons, buses to round people up in the incarceration facilities. This is all part of a set of industrial complex where people are making a good deal of money incarcerating people. And this is the same thing that you see happening just in criminal justice. And it's also the same thing that you see in warfare. And we have to look at capitalism as this problem when we're looking at these systems, right? So a lot of times people think of just, well, I need something and this is made by someone who owns a business, so capitalism must be good. But when something is not designed in order to serve the people, but rather to make a profit, it changes the nature of the thing that's being produced there. So when our foreign policy is directed by capitalism, it's good business to drop bombs on people. We can't imagine that the same decision about where or when or why we would drop that bomb is going to be the same decision, right? And the same thing is true with building a wall. And the same thing is true with incarcerating a migrant. When someone stands to benefit economically from that, in any instance, it's going to be a problem. And we need to look at the way in which this also, is connected to the way we eat, the food we eat and the clothes we buy, etc. We should really have an economy that's oriented around getting people their needs met, rather than somebody making money abstractly. And that a lot of this corruption that we see is really embedded into the fabric of our society and the way that our state functions.
Right.
And this is also this imposition which comes along with borders, the formation of the state, and how this is really an apparatus which is a set of violence against indigenous peoples.
Well, one of the things that I like that you said, or that I want to kind of expand upon, is that you said that they get to control who comes across for whatever the reason. And you pointed out the fact that they allow low wages, migrant wages workers to come, so that these companies can benefit from their basically slave wages. But something else that's just got passed in recent times is that in order for people to come across, they have to give away their Yahoo, their Facebook, their social media accounts, and maybe that's also something that they're going to be using to implicate who can and cannot. If they don't necessarily, maybe they're socially or politically not in alignment with what is acceptable in the United States of America or wherever, they're not going to be allowed across.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, really, it's are they going to use ways to keep people from crossing that border who may have political or social implications that would not benefit the infrastructure that they have in place in terms of the globalist kind of corporation extraction?
Well, any sort of censorship and in trying to figure out who gets to come into the country is going to be politically motivated. This is the sort of thing where it seems on the face of it like we maybe would screen for people who have some sort of allegiance to the country, or who are not, who don't have any sort of history of violence that they've spoken about, and I can understand why people might look at that and say, oh yeah, we want people who are nonviolent and who want to come to work hard in this country, and that sort of thing. But who makes these types of decisions? Who are the people who are looking at this, and how does that operate? I think is a question we have to ask ourselves. And the people that are currently running these systems of incarceration and policing around immigration are in the federal government right now are certainly not friends to any migrants or people who believe in human rights or social justice. It's also really important that we look at who these people are who are coming across, and what are the political situations that they come from, and what are the cultural situations that they come from. So right now, people who are detained, about 60% of them come from Guatemala. This is the majority, in North America. That's the majority indigenous country that we have, And we understand that the majority of people currently being held in detention facilities are indigenous peoples, speaking indigenous language, who have existed in these places they come from for thousands of years, and they're being displaced now. That's important, and we have to understand the geopolitical situation that's displacing them, and then also what are the impacts that are forcing them to seek asylum in the United States, and how they're being treated when they get to this country. Because if you're an indigenous person in Guatemala, you're going to be hit several places along the way. You're more likely to suffer discrimination from state and non-state actors in your home country. There was a civil war from 1960 to 1996 in Guatemala. There was an indigenous genocide that happened throughout the country, displaced a lot of people. And since then, there's also been economic policies which have disproportionately negatively affected indigenous communities. So if you're indigenous in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, you're more likely to be displaced by violence, to seek asylum, and also by economic factors and need some sort of work. Now, when you get to this country, you're also more likely to suffer discrimination. On the one hand, you might not speak Spanish, and you might not have access to legal services, to health services, which is why some of these children who have died in ICE custody, they've been indigenous peoples. This young girl who was shot last year by a Border Patrol agent, you see that she was also a Guatemalan indigenous girl. And so that's happening because on the one hand, maybe there's the language problem, but also there's another layer of discrimination. It sounds more foreign to hear this person speak their indigenous language than it does Spanish.
Right.
To these border agents. They're more likely to dismiss them, to think that they don't really come from here.
Right.
And so there's this layer of xenophobia which works against indigenous peoples in this way. And this is not just people who are coming from Guatemala. That's really the foundation of colonialism in this country as well. The idea that indigenous people do not belong here is what justifies this genocide which has been happening for hundreds of years, which has displaced people from the land. And of course, you wouldn't be able to have a United States of America if you didn't have this indigenous genocide. So this is something it's really threatening to the nation state to allow indigenous peoples to exist. And this idea is well used by this xenophobic administration to help foment anger towards indigenous peoples as well as migrants. And conflating those groups has been helpful for these right-wing forces to gain power, and they're really using that power in this negative way. However, it's also a really good opportunity for us to look at the decolonial elements of this struggle and build unity amongst peoples who are prison abolitionists, who are fighting for migrant rights, and people who are in favor of indigenous sovereignty, and see how we might work together to really address this colonial issue in places like Texas on the border, as well as throughout the country and throughout these lands, to really liberate people, allow them to migrate, and really help build constructive economies for each other to really to imagine the future that they want to have, where indigenous peoples can exist, and we can build good relationships with each other and with the land.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, and I agree with you 100%. So my next question is, one of the things I've noticed in the media in general is that they are trying to dehumanize, especially in regards to the children. Well, they're just, they shouldn't have brought them. Why'd they bring them? Da da da. And there's this. Why do you think that is? Why is it? Do you think it's so important for them to create a normalization of this kind of? They're less than. They are not. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that psychological?
Right.
Why is that the agenda?
Well, if we were to believe that all human beings have right to life, which many people in this country probably do not believe, but if we were to believe that, we would have to concede that we need to protect these children and we need to protect these people. And the media, for whatever reason, is having a hard time really saying, hey, listen, human rights needs to exist. Very little of the framing we see in the political world from either side is really focused around human rights. Oftentimes it's economic ideas or, oh, what's good for the economy, what's good for safety, and often not in terms of what really is good for human beings to live well. And these questions they allow and they justify people to commit these atrocities for this political gain. Listen, when we look at the amount of money that's being spent to incarcerate these kids from Guatemala, I mean, if we invested that money in improving the agrarian economy in Guatemala and allowing these subsistence farmers to live, it would cost a fraction of what we're spending to try to keep them out of this country. Those people could maintain those connections with their ancestral lands and be well. The fact of the matter is that the United States government and these corporations are investing money to extract from those places like Guatemala, pull oil out, pull gold out, increase the militarization, prop up these dictators there. They've been doing this for years throughout Latin America. And that's destabilizing these places. That's causing this migratory flow. This is dehumanization. This economic policy is dehumanizing. This military policy is dehumanizing. This immigration policy is dehumanizing. And we have to understand that the way in which this country is functioning right now isn't really giving people their human dignity. And when we ask this question about humanization, why is it so important that these kids are being dehumanized, we must also ask ourselves why it's so important for us to begin to humanize everybody and focus on our relationships that we have, not only with humans, but also with the non-human world, and figure that holding these relationships at the highest regard, giving dignity to all things in this world is really the foundation of the politics to come. And that really the way that we're building relationships with each other now, recognizing the humanity of other people, recognizing the sovereignty of the land itself, is really the answer to all these problems with immigration and war and the economic policy. And if we look at, oh, we've got to solve all these problems, what are we going to do with all these people, how are we going to stop this wall, what are these Republicans, Democrats, all these divisions, when we really focus on humanizing everyone, coming together as people, respecting the land, we really see that the answers are a lot closer than they appear, and that they're all around us in the world that we live in.
I really want to say thank you so much, Dr. Tane Ward, for coming on Native Wavelength. And you know, I believe that I really strongly believe in the things that you're saying, and the clarity and the way you say it. And I really appreciate all of the work that you've done with my communities and the communities in Texas and everywhere you visited. I just really appreciate you. And you know, as a mother and as a Native woman, you know, my heart goes out to these people too, these families, and to these children. You know, I could not even imagine what it must be like to have to suffer that kind of that human suffering, and you know, I try to include them in my prayers as often as I can.
Absolutely, all the people, those who are coming here, as well as all the indigenous peoples and all the work that people have done for generations to protect the sovereignty of their people along the borderlands. You know, I want to give thanks to all of those.
This is definitely a subject we're going to have to revisit and talk about until it's fixed, because you know, I know that there's, you know, from my own experience, there's been so many communities that are trying to figure out a way to express themselves, to how do they help. You know, I know people that have been turned away. They've sent donations. They show up to the place, and the people are like sending them back with their donations, with diapers and things like that. You know, I've been involved in other communities that are, you know, here in the art. Austin is such a beautiful art community, where we've tried to reenact what it must be like to be that Guatemalan mother having their baby taken away from them, and to see those communities really come from the heart. You know, whether they're speaking through their poetry, through their art, through that way, it all affects us on a very deep level. Whether you're the perpetrator or you're the person benefiting from that extraction of resources, or you know, or you're in the denial of the fact that these are human beings. There's a part of us that's all connected, and I think that we're experiencing that trauma along with those people in some way, in some fashion. You know, I don't want to see that happen to any mother or any children or any human beings at all. So I want to say thank you so much for listening to Native Wavelength.
Ya, ya, hey, ya, ya, hey, ya, ya, hey, ya, ya.